Hello and welcome to another session of Excel Programming for Clinicians with me, Dlotson Callum. Now this is the first of a two-part set of videos in which I introduce you to some key Excel objects. We will start by first asking the question, what exactly is an object in programming? We will then take a look at the cells object, the range object, the selection object, the rows object, and the columns object. So before we look at some Excel objects, let's have a think about objects in the real world. Take this simple object, a syringe. Now this syringe has a number of properties, such as the volume and color, for instance. How do we set those, or how do we get those in Excel VBA programming? This syringe also has a number of actions it can perform. For instance, it can inject. Again, let's take a look at how we do that in Excel. So to represent the volume property, we put the name of the object, we put the dots notation that we spoke about earlier, and then we put the property, in this case volume. We then set that property to some value. And this is how we set properties in Excel VBA programming. To get the property, we ask the question, what is object.property? So we query the object and ask it what the value of a particular property is. Let's take another property such as color. We set the color by putting the object's name, a dot notation, and then the property that we want to set, and then we set that property to some value. Again, to get that property out, if we wanted to use it somewhere, we ask the question, what is that particular property of that object? So what is the color property of the syringe object? So these are how we get and set properties, but this syringe also performs some actions. To represent an action in Excel VBA programming, we put the object's name, we again use our dot notation, and then we put the action that we want to perform, and we put brackets at the end of it. Brackets at the end of a name attached to an object by a dot notation usually means that that is an action. Now sometimes that action can take a value. For instance, you might want to say, well, how much do you want to inject? And you might pass in a value to the method. So in this case, we're passing in the value 20 to the inject method of the syringe object. So it's very similar in Excel programming. All of the objects in Excel, from the workbook itself to the sheets, to the individual cells, the columns, the ranges, they are all represented as objects. And we can set and get the properties of those objects, and we can call methods on those objects, sometimes passing in values to those methods. We'll go and take a look at how we do that next. Let's start with the cells object. Now, every single cell in Excel can be represented as an object which has properties and methods that we can manipulate. If you're following along, please go to the Exercises tab, right-click on the Cells button, click on Assign Macro, make sure the assigned macro is the cells object, and click on Edit. The first thing I want to do is select a cell. In this case, I want to select cell C15. To do that, I type cells, open bracket, I put the row number, comma, the column number, close bracket, I put a dot, and then I put the method that I want to call. Now with that in place, if I were to run this macro, you will see here in Excel that it's automatically selected cell C15. Now that I have selected the cell, I want to set some of its properties. First, I want to set the value property, and I want to set that equal to some text. I also want to set the font size and color. Now to set the color, there are several methods that you can use. I will use the red, green, blue method and set some values. Finally, I will set the font style. Let's run this code and see what we get. As you can see, it's done exactly as we intended. We have managed to manipulate the properties of this cell object. Now let's comment out this code. You can do that by putting an apostrophe in front of the line, or you can highlight all the lines you want to comment out and select the comment block option from our edit menu. Let's set some more properties. This time I'll set the red property to 0, the green property to 255, and the blue property to 0. So now I'm expecting the text to be green. I will also change the font style to bold italic. Let's run this and see what we get. As you can see, the font has been changed to green, bold, italic. Let's comment this out and see what else we can do. Let's select a different cell. Still in row 15, but this time I'm going to select the 4th column, which will be column D. And I will set the value to cell D15. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, it selected the right cell and it's put the text in that we intended. Now let's set the font and font color and style of this cell D15, but using slightly different programming code than the one we've used up till now. So far, we've always had to type cells, the row and column, font, and then the specific font property that we want to set, whether the color or the font style. There's a slightly different way of doing this. If you're repeating the same text over and over again, you can select that text and use the with programming language. So we say with this item. Now I can put a dot and say size and set it to some value. I don't have to repeat cells 15:3 font. In fact, I want cell column 4 in this instance. I'll set the size to 14. I'll set the color to red, green, blue. Again to green. And I'll set the font style. And then I will say end with. This block of code does something very similar to the block of code we had before, except I'm not having to type in the cells and the font in every line. Let's run the code and see what we get. As expected, the cell is selected and the font is changed to bold italic. Next, let's take a look at the range object. From the exercise tab, right-click on range, select assign macro, make sure the range object is selected and click on edit. Now, a range in Excel simply represents a range of cells, a selection of cells. If I select 2 cells, that is a range. On the other hand, a single cell can also be represented as a range. Let's select some ranges. One way to select a range is to type in the object name range, open bracket, and then in quotation marks, identify the cells that you want to select. So I want to select cell C16 to E16. And then I'll call the select method. Sometimes Excel gives you what they call IntelliSense. It intelligently senses what you're trying to type and it offers that to you and you can select it. Let's run this code and see what we get. As you can see, it's selected the range of cells I identified. Now, what can we do with this? We might, for instance, want to merge this range. And we might want to set some values. I've selected the value option using the up and down arrow, and I'm going to select tab to enter the value. Now I can set that value to some text. Range C16 to E16. I can set the font size and color. I'm setting the color to blue. And I want to set the font style to bold. Finally, I want to set the cell color, background color. In Excel, the way you do that is you look for the interior color. And you set that to some value. So I'll have a mixture of red, some green, and some blue. Let's run the code and see what we get. In fact, let's step through the code by setting a breakpoint, hitting run, and then stepping through one step at a time. As you can see, the cells are selected, they are merged, the font size is set, next the color, next the bold, and finally the background color is set. But as you can see, we've had to type range and then font on every line. Can we do this with the with notation? Let's have a look at how we do that. This time I'll select F16 to H16. I will merge them and I will set some value. Finally, I'll say with that range and the fonts property, set the size to 14, set the font style to, let's go for bold italic, and let's end with. Finally, let's set the background color. Remember, the background color is set by setting the interior color. This time, rather than use red, green, blue, I'm going to use a color index. And I will set that color index to some value. Let's comment out this code and run our new code. As you can see, we've selected the right range, we've entered the value, and we've set the font and background color. But where did we get this value from? Index color equals 14. If you're following along, if you go to the color index tab, you will see a color palette with the value of every color. In this instance, I've chosen color 44. Okay, let's comment out this code and see what else we can do with the range. As I mentioned, you can select single cells with a range object. To do that, type in range and in brackets, put the value of the cell you want to select. Now that I've selected the cell, I can set some property. Let's set the value property to the name of the cell. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, I've selected the right cell and I've set the value property. What are some of the other ways to select ranges? Let's comment out this code and take a look. I can, for instance, say I want range C17, comma, and E17. And I call the select method on that range. What do you think will happen when I select this range? What I expect to happen is that two separate cells will be selected, cell C17 and cell E17. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, two separate cells have been selected and the value property of both those ranges have been set to C17 and E17. What if I wanted to select cell C17 to E17? Let's see how we write that. Let's comment out this code and enter range C17 semicolon E17. Select. This should now select all three cells. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, all three cells have been selected and their values set to C17 to E17. You can also use the range object to select a whole column. If I type in range, bracket open, and then I put in column B to column B. Let's run the code and see what happens. As you can see, the whole of column B has been selected. You can also use the range object to select a whole row. Let's see what happens when we run this code. The whole of row 16 is now selected. Finally, you can use the range object to select a block of cells. Let's see what happens when we run this code. It selected a whole block. We can set properties on this block, such as the lines around the selection. Here I'm selecting the range object and I'm setting the line style of the borders property to be continuous. Let's run the code and see what we get. Next, let's look at the selection object. To start with, let's select a range. Now, before, when we were working with ranges, to merge this, we typed something like the range object, and then we call the merge method. What that means, we keep on typing the range object over and over again. But given that we've selected a particular range, we now have access to the selection object. The selection object represents anything that's currently selected. It could be one cell or it could be a range of cells. So now that we have access to that, we can instead call the merge method of the selection object. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, the cells have been selected and they've been merged. What else can we do with the selection object? Well, we can say selection dot, and we can set the value property to some value. As before, we can also set the font style and font size and font color. Here I'm setting the fonts to black by setting red, green and blue all to 0. And I'm setting the interior color to what I hope is a nice value. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, a cell range has been selected, and with that selection, we've merged the cells and we've set the font size and color and the background color of the selection. As before, we can also use the width notation. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's comment out this code. And select a new range. We again want to call the merge method of the selection object. And we want to set the value of the selection object. We set the value property to some new text. And now we want to use our width notation. So we say width selection dot font. Now we don't have to keep on typing selection and font again. We can just say dot size. And we can say dot color. Now I'm setting the color to white by setting the red, green and blue all to 255. Finally, I'm setting the font style and I'm ending the width. I now want to set the interior color, which sets the background color. But this time, I want to use color index. And I'll set that equal to some value. And if we go to our color palette, you can see the value I'm trying to set it to. Let's run our code and see what we get. The code has run and done exactly as we expected. Next, we'll take a look at the row object. Now, every row in Excel can be represented by a row object. So here, I'm calling the select method on the rows object, and I'm passing in a value of 19 to say I want to select row 19. Let's run the code and see what happens. As you can see, the row is selected. Now with that selection, we can do all sorts of things to the properties. We can, for instance, set the row height property to some value. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, the height of the row changed. Let's comment that out and see what else we can do. This time, I'm selecting a row and I'm calling the insert method on that row. What do you think happens when I run this code? As you can see, this has inserted a row above row 19. Let's comment out this line and see how you delete a row. With the row selected, all I need to do is call on the selection object, is enter the selection object and call the delete method of that object. And the row is deleted. Next, we'll look at the column object. Similarly to rows, with columns, you can specify a column and call the select method of that column. Let's see what happens when we run this code. As you can see, column A is selected. Now with that selection, I can manipulate various properties such as column width, for instance. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, the column width was adjusted. What else can we do? Let's comment out this code and take a look. Similar to rows, we can call the insert method of a column object. Let's run the code and see what we get. As you can see, a new column has been inserted. With that selection, we can also call the delete method. And the column which is selected will be deleted. What else can we do? Let's select column B. And with this selection, let's set the orientation of the text to 90 degrees. Let's also set the horizontal alignment to center. And finally, let's set the vertical alignment to centered as well. Let's run this code and see what we get. As you can see, the entries in column B have been adjusted as we intended. So that was a very quick introduction to some very key Excel objects, which you will need to learn how to manipulate in order to be productive in your Excel programming journey. In the next video, we'll take a look at some more just as useful Excel objects. See you in the next video.